Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Just before we start today's episode all about MS, Dr. Travis Brown, you've been talking to MS Australia and we've got some links that we can share with people.
So yes, we've been putting into the show notes some of the information they've sent through. So they've been wonderful. They've sent through a whole bunch of links and resources, first of all for healthcare professionals and doctors, but also for patients themselves. This includes things like, key facts and figures, media briefing about MS, understanding MS. So this is like a 2-page version, as well as the MS clinics and, brain health with MS. So they're fantastic resources. It's really what people are wanting to convey, as well as there's a whole amazing part about research, as well as, remyelination and stuff. So please, if you just click on the show notes or just in the podcast, this information will come up.
And also at thismedicallife.com.au, you'll find it there for this episode. And we might even pop a couple of the videos in on the show notes as well that they gave us. So, Dr. Travis Brown, we're talking multiple sclerosis in this episode of This Medical Life. And it's the one disease which has an initialism, MS, that has become part of mainstream popular culture. It's one of the few.
Look, it's an amazing disease. If we look all the way back, we find the first instances in the 15th century. And
it's only a pathologist who would say it's an amazing disease.
I think we've learned that as soon as a pathologist gets interested in something, it's normally a bad thing, unfortunately, for the patient. But what it is, yes, if we trace back the steps, we can find the first instances in the 15th century. And the person's name's Lidwina. She's Dutch. She was born in 1380. Now, she was the daughter of a labourer. She was one of 9 children. She was a healthy child, and all the information we get is, for whatever reason, she became unwell about the age of 15 or 16. She became unwell, recovered, nothing seemed to be thought of it. And at the age of 16, though, there's an instance where she's ice skating on a frozen canal, and she falls. Now, it's a little bit hard to say, did she fall and hit her head, or did she fall on her face? But she injures herself quite significantly. She needs help to get up, and her healing was slow. And after this instance, she needed help walking, and she had to use the furniture to assist herself to walk. And I wasn't sure if she had broken her ribs in the fall. And while she did recover from this, and it was slow, she started having these other odd symptoms that have been reported, and things like continual difficulty walking, which you wouldn't think just from a fall.
No, and you would expect that sort of fall would be fairly common.
And also she was 16, so young, healthy, vibrant. She became blind in one eye, and then one of the things that they say, she had significant pain in her teeth. And so these episodes then either abate or they continue. Again, she gets another episode of blindness in the eye. starts getting sensitive to light, so having difficulty with brightness, and she becomes confined to her bed. And there's one other thing that she gets is this unbearable pain in her right shoulder. So by the age of 19, her condition is slightly improved. She's able to walk, but walk with difficulty. She has a condition that they sort of classify as a split face or a hanging lip. And this seems to indicate some facial weakness. Soon she's got both legs are paralyzed, developing sores, which could be pressure sores if she's lying down a fair bit, and she has impaired vision. She's regularly visited by the parish priest, Father John Pott, and his suggestion is, look, it might have been normal for the day, but it seems strange for us.
Okay.
He suggested that she join her suffering with that of the Lord. So he was clearly said this is possibly a divine-given disease, but she took it a little bit further.
Uh-oh.
She stated that not only was she going to suffer, suffering would be her joy. And she even took steps to increase her discomfort. So wouldn't sleep on a feather bed, but slept on wooden planks.
Don't let the government hear this, because this could solve all their Medicare funding issues if they took this on board.
Well, look, this what they called a pious attitude, and she attracted a lot of attention because of this. And physicians came to see her, but the prevailing attitude was, again, this was a disease given to her by God, and it could not be cured, therefore. So she had brief periods of improvement, but otherwise the disease progressed. She had increasing pain and weakness. She had difficulty swallowing in time. Initially, as it always goes, difficulty swallowing solids, then moving on to liquids. And by 1407, after 10 to 11 years of symptoms, she starts getting these hallucinations.
Which is different, Travis, to when you're convalescing at home these days watching daytime television.
Yes, very much so. So now these are interpreted as supernatural visits.
Of course.
Ecstasies. And she reportedly saw purgatory, saw heaven, was visited by saints. What the area this now fits into is you start to get into mythology, awe that grew around Lidwina at this time. They say that, this is the quote, is that her putrefying body gave off a fragrant perfume.
Oh.
Her room glowed, and, it said her only sustenance over several years was just communion. And so this is where we start to see the path that this story goes down for Lidwina. Now, again, she ended up interpreting these symptoms as being a victim for others. Her suffering was her joy, and eventually in 1433, at the age of 53, she died. And this is an amazing story. And the reason it's such amazing is we've got such detailed notes on that. She ended up having people writing a biography of her right after it. There was a name by a Franciscan priest, Johannes Brugman, after her death, visited all the people, she knew the priests, the clerics, local people, and documented what would have been a divine disease given to a patient that they suffered through for others.
And intriguingly, this writing up of it is the sort of gift that does keep on giving over the ages.
Well, we can look back at it and see, what was going on here? And there was a second biography written of her 15 years after the first one, so you've got quite a lot of detailed information. And then in 1890, Lidwina is canonized. She's a saint. And so, this was done by Pope Leo XIII. She's the patron saint of sickness and of figure skating. So you can see now where Saint Lidwina comes from, and that's her story. She is, in these times, God gave her a disease to suffer for others. And so, that's an incredible presentation, but we can understand the disease looking at it from this perspective where we are today. And so there's a second person I want to mention in a similar category. His name is Augustus Dieste, and he is the grandson of King George III. Now, King George III actually features in another podcast of ours about urine, but we'll come back to that later.
I'm holding on.
And what Augustus has, and the reason why he's such a notable figure in this, is because he's clearly in affluent society. We have 26 years of notes of his experience of this disease in his own words. But he's the illegitimate son of Prince Augustus Frederick and Lady Augustus Murray. And the reason why is because King George III learnt about their wedding and was not happy about it, and then annulled the marriage, and then he was then an illegitimate son of the royal.
That's not fair. No. That's after the event.
Well, I can't work out how it can be your son. You learn of the wedding later and then annul it because you're not happy. It's such an unusual, you would think you would know that your son's getting married. But it happens so after the event, they had already had a son and he annulled it. And this was Augustus. And so...
Maybe his invitation got lost in the post.
Maybe, I'm not quite sure. But the father abandoned the marriage.
Oh.
And the mother had to raise him alone in England. And so by the age of 14, Augustus had contracted measles. Now, interestingly enough, he was vaccinated against smallpox with variolation. Our episode 4 in This Pathological Life, if you go back to that, it was done by Lady Montague, who featured in that one. And he ended up joining the military. He served in America against the British, involved with the British against the Americans, and where they were defeated in near New Orleans in 1815. And he was given a knighthood, but he wasn't happy with just a knighthood. He wanted recognition as being a legitimate royal. So by the age of 28, though, we get this episode. And he's gone to a funeral, and after the funeral suffers blurry vision. Now, he interpreted this as he went to the funeral and held in the tears. So he thought it was suppressed tears that gave him the blurred vision. This progressed, and he even needed people assisting him to read. And so eventually his eyesight improved, and 2 further episodes of this occurred in the preceding years. In October of 1827, he wrote,
"At Florence, I began to suffer from a confusion of sight. Each eye had its separate visions. Dr. Kissock supposed bile to be the cause. I was twice blooded from the temples by leeches. Purges were administered. 1 vomit, and twice I lost blood from the arm. One of the times it was with difficulty that the blood was obtained. The malady in my eyes abated. Again I saw all objects naturally in their single state. I was able to go out and walk. Now a new disease began to show itself. I could clearly perceive each succeeding day that I went up and down the staircase with great difficulty. A torpor or numbness and want of sensation became apparent about the end of the backbone and the perineum. At length, about 4th of December, my strength of legs quite left me, and twice in one day I fell down upon the floor. I was obliged to remain on the floor until my servant came and picked me up. I remained in this extreme state of weakness for about 21 days, during which period I fell down about 5 times, never fainting, from my legs not being strong enough to carry my body. I never once fainted or had any sort of fit. Debility, extreme debility, was the only cause of my falling."
And so he starts seeking treatment for this. He starts trying to understand, and you can read in there where he says extreme debility. That to me struck out when I read that quote. He is a person frustrated. And is another doctor gave him a different treatment for his eyes, drinking and bathing in something called still water and what they say douching the eyes, pretty much cleaning the eyes. Another doctor prescribed him a different one.
Eat beefsteaks twice a day, drink London porter and sherry and Madeira wines.
And
by the way, do we know that doctor? Because I want that doctor.
I imagine, 3 different drinks. So he was also seeking to have his legs rubbed twice a day with brushes, his back rubbed with liniment of alcohol, opium, and Florence oil. Look, these results he turned around and said was a complete success.
Oh.
His strength returned. And later they did something that is not unusual for the time, but it's unusual to they often treated with horseback riding. So they thought, horseback riding was a good overall, general, healthy thing to do. And look, it was as a preventative and a treatment. But then he got this pain in his kidneys. And so the physicians treated this with something that I've not come across before, but they talk about putting an irritant across all the skin of the flanks that makes the skin erupt, and that pain, that counteracts the pain of their kidneys. And so...
Hang on a moment. This is like that. I've got a toothache, so you hit your finger with a hammer to take your mind off the other one.
This is what they were doing. Now, that didn't work, so he used heat, flannel heat, as much as he could tolerate at that time. And then he would bath and wash in zinc. He would use herbs and have herb baths. But again, as we would know, whilst he thinks it might work and have improvements, that's the disease process, none of this would have helped. And then, unfortunately, as would be, he met a young woman, but he complained that his acts of connectedness lacked wholesome vigor. And so he was talking about impotence at that point in time. And, his treatment at that point in time is they inserted a metal catheter into his penis. They gave him pills. They gave him medicines. He had a course of electricity and tepid douches of the loins and sacrum. Again, it's hard to know, but some he thought succeeded, some didn't. And, by the 1840s, 18 years after his first symptoms, he's continuing these therapies, at the point of using hydrotherapy, where they're using wet sheets and different medications. And some doctors just diagnosed him with paraplegia, but what they talk about is active and passive paraplegia. And so this, they said, was passive paraplegia, and it could be controlled by diet or calming his emotions or, quieting his heart. He had treatment such as iron, mercury, rest, riding, and his handwriting was deteriorating. So we were having a few successes, lots of fails, and he started having balance issues. He starts having paraparesis, so feeling sensation problems. And eventually, Augustus dies from this disease. And there is one person I want to mention, and they're just on the cusp of us really having the scientific breakthrough of what this disease is and how it behaves. And his name is Bruce Frederick Cummings. And now he was born in 1889. And at the start of the 20th century, there's a publication under the pen name of W.N.P. Barbellin. It's called The Journal of a Disappointed Man. Now, this is Bruce. He's writing about a diagnosis he will never know, but his family will find out. He started his diary at the age of 13. He enjoyed mathematics, he enjoyed English, he enjoyed writing. And by the age of 18, he began experiencing some symptoms. Now, these are similar symptoms to the ones we've discussed, but he was determined not to be a victim.
I am not going to be beaten. If I develop all the disease in the doctor's index, I mean to do what I set out to do if it has to be done in a bath chair.
And so if we look at each of the lives that we've mentioned, they have great courage. And in what can only be described as progressive symptoms. And look, they would have had to have known that things are getting worse as time progressed. And eventually they would know that this disease was going to be their demise. And in their own writings, you can feel their frustrations at their failing bodies. And there is a dream, and Bruce mentions this in his writing, there's a dream that each one of them, or the circumstances they had, they must have felt like.
It would be nice if a physician from London one of these days were to gallop up Hotspur, tether his horse to the gatepost, and dash in waving a reprieve, the discovery of a cure.
Unfortunately for these people back then, this was never going to be. But fortunately, things were going to change.
Travis, no physician has galloped Hotspur yet to this topic, but let's continue with part 2 of this exploration of MS.
So we've seen the patient experience of this clearly where they don't know what's going on, they know they're unwell, and they know that it's going to get worse. It's around this time when people are writing about their experiences that we're starting to get the scientific and the medical community starting to understand or starting to piece together the puzzles that is this disease. And 1800s, we've got Charles Prosper Olivier Diangers. He's reporting of a 20-year-old male who has this right foot weakness, and by the time this gentleman's 29 years old, he's got his both legs are weak. Later on, he experiences urinary retention and speech problems and difficulty writing. Now, Charles terms this as a, quote, myelitis. So he's saying, there must be some sort of inflammation happening. It lasted for 29 years for this patient. But later on, we start to get, now there's a fantastic, talented artist. You can actually go online and look him up. He produced a book that's called Pathological Anatomy and published in 1838. Now, he started drawing just different body parts and pathology of organs, autopsies, and he describes 2 patients, and both of these patients were affected by paralysis, and he was involved in conducting an autopsy and found multiple lesions on the spinal cord. Now, he drew and described them.
Brown, transparent discolorations without softening of the spinal cord. This is a peculiar diseased state of the cord and pons varoli.
And then the second patient confused him, though. He wasn't sure because of different presentation.
In the other case, there was no other lesion present than that to which I allude, to which the paralysis could be attributed. The anterior surface of the spinal cord presented a number of spots, from 1/4 of an inch to an inch in breadth, of an irregular form of a yellowish-brown colour, smooth, glossy, without vascularity or any alteration in the colour or consistence of the surrounding medullary substance.
So, at about the same time, we have another artist, I think is probably the best way to put it. His name is Jean Crevellier, and he produced similar illustrations, and he called these diseases of the spinal cord. Now, these are very similar drawings, and he ended up presenting these illustrations.
A cook aged 37 has been ill for 6 years without known cause. Firstly, she noticed her left leg resisted her will, that she fell in the street. 3 months later, the right was affected. The upper extremities became tremulous and weak. Sensation was unaffected. Swallowing became difficult. She complained of feebleness of vision. I had made the diagnosis of a lesion of the upper portion of the spinal cord.
And so this is now where they're starting to piece it. So when we look, initially it's just these patients had paralysis. Now Jean looks at this and says, this is the symptoms the patient has, and is able to link that to the same disease. The problem was his theory at the time was this disease was caused by suppression of sweat.
Mind you, can I just say, that is a magnificent leap from just being a gift from God.
Yeah, well, that's right. This is a few hundred years on, and they're starting to piece it together. And so information starts to pile up that people are starting to link these symptoms to this kind of a disease. And there's a lot of people who contribute to this, but the person who needs or is given the most credit is Jean-Martin Charcot. Now, he's considered the forefather of neurology. Now, he was born in 1825, and he pursued a career in medicine and succeeded. Now, he worked with another gifted doctor. His name is Alfred Vulpian, and these two together published separately but clearly worked together in this field. And they rose through the ranks. But I think what needs to be pointed out here is the sheer challenge towards Charcot and his contemporaries. The multitude of diagnoses we have in neurology is phenomenal. And the symptoms they have are many and varied. And to try and distill it down, just an example, what they're talking about is, they had a disease called dementia paralytica. Now, it wasn't sure what that was. These patients, or, dementia of the insane, or, this was effectively what worked out to be was neurosyphilis. Now, they wouldn't have known that, but they classified in that area. We know that now. They had a condition called paralysis agitans, we now know as Parkinson's disease. And to separate all out their symptoms as being different diseases, not related, would have been a monumental task.
And a layperson's question here, you're talking about all these different variations of diagnoses. Is this where the multiple term comes in the term multiple sclerosis, or is that just a layperson's misconception?
No, multiple will be because there's multiple lesions.
Okay.
So that's what I believe anyway. The multiple sclerosis means you've got multiple plaques in different areas. And so what we have then, clearly when Charcot's learning about all of this, there is a pivotal time in 1866 when he gives a lecture on what he calls sclerosis and plaque disseminee. And we have what ends up becoming sclerosis and plaque, what we know as multiple sclerosis. One critical feature that stands out to me in all of this is Charcot's servant. It's spelled L-U-C, Luce, and she suffered from tremors, particularly in the head and the limbs. Now, this was just initially slight, but became progressively worse. Now, you're working for, the forefather of, neurology, so he diagnoses her with shaking palsy. But the symptoms worsen. This tremor, he noticed, was an intention tremor. Now, what does that mean?
Yeah.
When you go to move or you're trying to do something, the tremor happens. It occurs. It is because you are doing an intentional action. Now, this, with voluntary movements, this is different to Parkinson's, which has a resting tremor. So when the patient's not doing anything, they have movement, often called a pill rolling movement. And so that's an important distinction, and that's remarkable, because I would have looked at it and thought they're both the same, but no, they are very different, and it's important in this instance. Eventually, Luce was unable to work. She was admitted to hospital and eventually died. Now, Charcot performed the autopsy, and he found these numerous sclerotic plaques on the spinal cord, but he also found it in the brain. And now he hadn't noticed that before in other patients, and the lesions appeared identical. And shortly after, he saw a patient with the same features Luce had. And what we now know as Charcot's triad, the patient had an intention tremor, nystagmus, which is a classical finding of the eye where it movement,
Right.
and scanning speech, what we call slow or drawling speech. And he found that these were identical, and he diagnosed them with sclerosis and plaque. This is the first living patient diagnosed with the disease. And so he even draws the images. There's microscopic drawings of what he looked under the microscope when he saw them. and he noticed inflammation and demyelination in these areas. He'd continued the study. He found these were more likely to be women. The onset was around 25 to 30 years. It could be as early as 14 years, though. They rarely lived beyond 40 years. It did not appear to have a hereditary link. This was not something that occurred in families. There was some linkage between infectious disease. He said typhoid, cholera, smallpox, and there may have been some association with the moist or cold or trauma. So it's remarkable what he was able to glean from all the patients who had it, the lesions that it, and that Charcot's triad that classified this disease. Now, what do we know today? We know this is an autoimmune disease. We know these plaques are areas of inflammation. Now, we call this perivenular. So it seems to occur around veins, but it's hard to know whether this is a primary action or is this a secondary. It just, the inflammation happens and then it happens around veins, or is it veins or vice versa, whichever. There is demyelination. Now, what does that mean? It means that the signals going through the spinal cord, the myelin helps conduct it and makes it move faster. This inflammation destroys the myelin, and then the signals can either get lost or interfered with.
Right. Okay.
And so what we call the axon nerve, so the big, long, stretchy part of the nerve, initially it's not damaged, but over time it can be. And again, then you're really unable to transmit any signal going through. And so we see with that disease remyelination, so the body tries to heal it, but it's not able to get there a lot of the times, and it just progressively worse. Now, there's a huge discussion in the scientific community as to how the lesion gets there. Is this what we call, is it a T cell reaction, the immune cells that do it? T cell, then you've got B cells with it, or is it B cells with T cells? It's very complex, and I won't get into that today, mainly because I have difficulty understanding it myself. But this is an inflammatory lesion that causes problems transmitting signals to and from the spine. And so as much as Charcot knew about this disease process, he also knew the limitations that he had.
The prognosis is extremely severe. We have shown that despite remission lasting sometimes for a very long period, the disease progresses by aggravation, in the end preventing any movements. We do not know of a single case of healing, and one should be aware of complications that may occur during the course of the disease and increase its severity.
And so what we're here now, over a century, and we have not only learnt to manage this once fatal disease, but for the most part, we can stop it in its tracks.
For the last part of this episode looking at multiple sclerosis, we have Dr. James Leyden, a working general neurologist based in Adelaide, to join us and give us the view from his end of the spectrum. James, welcome to This Medical Life.
Thanks for having me. Hi, Stephen. Hope you're well.
Well, I am, thank you. And it's been a fascinating glimpse into the history of MS thus far. But before you go any further, just how common is it today, particularly in Australia, but globally?
Yeah, that's actually a really tricky question to answer for a whole bunch of reasons. The diagnosis is made now by different criteria than it used to be. So we are getting much better at diagnosing the condition much earlier. But even so, we know that the incidence is increasing quite rapidly. Studies have shown that it's increased by about 50% between 1996 and 2011, and nobody knows for sure why that is. The numbers that are given for the incidence of MS when I was at medical school were typically 1 in 10,000. Different studies are now showing that it could be as high as 1 in 1,000, depending on which region you're in and which group of people you're talking about.
I'm a former journo, and part of me wants to just tease that apart a little bit, because sometimes we find better diagnosis leads to an increase in numbers. Could that possibly be at play here?
Absolutely. We are doing far more MRI scans for far more mild reasons than we used to do in the past. So number one, we're doing many more scans. Number two, the criteria at which we were allowed to call a condition multiple sclerosis has also changed. And so we are now able to diagnose it much, much earlier in the condition. For example, you used to need 2 definite relapses in different parts of the nervous system to make a diagnosis, but now we can make a diagnosis with 1 relapse with certain criteria on the MRI scan. And with the help of the MRI scans and with much more education amongst the medical workforce, we're able to diagnose much more mild forms of the conditions that may never have been diagnosed in an entire lifetime. But even accounting for that, the incidence is dramatically increasing.
I see. And looking at demography, is there a particular demographic of person more susceptible to MS?
Most of the increase in MS is actually happening in the group that's most affected, and that's women. Females are affected more than males by about a 3-to-1 ratio. The other big factor that changes incidence is the distance from the equator. So the further away from the equator you get, the more likely you are to have multiple sclerosis. And the other big factor before widespread use of vitamins was the further inland that you went. So the further inland that you lived, the more likely you were to get MS. And that was thought to be due to fish consumption. So the combination of fish and sunlight, and the thought was that vitamin D deficiencies play a role, in the incidence overall. And by and large, we know that it's not just the genetics, because people who move from the regions in the equator to regions either further south or further north actually then have their risk increased as well.
Wow, these seem almost like supplementary risk factors. Looking backwards at the data, do we know about any proactive risk factors, or is that what you're talking about? That if you live further away, you are more at risk as a correlation?
Yeah, so that's quite it's a little controversial. So there are definitely genetic factors at play. So if you have a relative with MS, you're more likely to get it. We can talk about that a bit more in a second.
Sure.
Things like smoking play a big role. So if you're a cigarette smoker, you're far more likely to get MS. And the other huge factor is the Epstein-Barr virus. If you do not have the Epstein-Barr virus, you cannot get MS. So we know the Epstein-Barr virus is a critical factor, in the development of MS. The trouble is, to not get Epstein-Barr virus, you'd have to be living in a bubble, perhaps on another planet, because it's just so common and widespread.
Something for inhabitants of Mars to look forward to in a few generations' time.
They'll bring it with them.
Oh, true. And just teasing further, Dr. Travis Brown, of course, not with us, but he's curious to know if you can explain the pathogenesis of the disease as we understand it today.
So this is an area that's been undergoing, a real 180-degree turnaround since I started in medical school. So we were taught that it was in part an inflammatory disease that leads to a degenerative process. We know that that's entirely not true. It's an entirely inflammatory disorder. And that's only relatively recently been proven as much as a few years ago. Why this happens, it's still unknown. So there are many, many different theories, and treatments work in different aspects, but the immune system is incredibly complicated. We think that the brain is complicated as a neurologist, but the immune system takes it to another level. And at the moment, that's all it is different theories. So people look at different aspects of the immune system and find that certain aspects are overactive. Certain cells of the immune system called T cells and certain subsets of those cells. And then people look at certain subsets of a kind of cell called B cell. And then people look at the different molecules that trigger a cascade. What we know for sure is that something triggers the immune system to start attacking the brain and the spinal cord. And when we see these spots on the MRI scan, we know that's the tip of the iceberg. It was thought that these little spots represented areas of attack, and that was where the disease was limited to. We now know that the disease actually affects the entire brain, and that what we're seeing on the scan is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on. So it's very complicated, but we are understanding more and more it's an entirely immune-mediated process. We know that this virus has a critical role to play, and that the immune response to that virus in some way triggers off a cascade of neural damage. Anything else beyond that is pure guesswork, but clearly factors such as vitamin D, we believe, influence the way in which the immune system is molded. And before the listeners and everyone says you must go out and have vitamin D, there isn't yet a study to prove that the consumption of vitamin D in any way helps MS. The thought is that perhaps vitamin D deficiency is particularly problematic in the womb rather than later life. So it's not a clear-cut thing that everyone with MS should take vitamin D, though most people do. There's no actual evidence for that. So the pathogenesis of MS, the short answer is nobody knows, which is pretty amazing in the year 2021.
Isn't it? And as you highlight the complexity of our immune system, this is just going to be a footnote, and you may not want to touch this, but as you look at social media, at all our armchair immunologists who are weighing in on everything to do with COVID-19, it must make you roll your eyes to the back of your head.
Yeah, it's certainly, it's just so sophisticated. And then when people think that you might take a certain vitamin, boost your immune system, it's just, you want to sort of try to relay the complexity of that, and that there would be pros and cons, even if it did work. If something could perhaps boost your immune system, it may be terribly pathological for you. But to put it in context, trying to say you could boost the immune system would be like looking at one particular brand of tire for one car and saying that you've improved efficiency of the entire transport network.
Okay, I'm going to work on that analogy because I need something to counter these fisticuffs that take place in social media. Thanks for going down that rabbit hole with me. Let's come back to our topic at hand, because you touched on the possibilities of genetic predisposition earlier. And interestingly, in Travis's history of MS, some of the early researchers who stumbled upon the symptoms were very clear. There doesn't seem to be any genetic history linked here. So what do we know about genetic predisposition?
We do know there is a complicated relationship with genetics. As you can see, we've mentioned the fact that the story involves the Epstein-Barr virus, and the story involves modification or the development of the immune system. And so we know at the heart, everything is either genetics or environment. So there is no attribute of a human that doesn't have some genetic or environmental contribution. So whilst there are genes, they're only part of the issue. But for example, in identical twin studies, if your identical twin has MS, then your lifetime risk of developing MS is about 30%. So you have a first-degree relative, that is a brother, a sister, mother or father with MS, then your lifetime risk is thought to be around 7%. So this is a relatively low percentage in terms of historical cases, so you can understand why people might not have been able to prove that in the past. People are chasing down the genes, and most of the genes, the strongest risk seems to be in the group of genes that use to manufacture a kind of receptor called an HLA type. And this is the mechanism which cells use to take samples from within them and display them to the immune cells like a passport and say, I'm okay, I'm safe. And you present it to the immune cells, and the immune cells inspect it, and they decide whether or not there could be a virus inside or not. And that's, particularly intriguing because we know that something has gone wrong with the virus response. So, that's one aspect, and more genes are being discovered. But we definitely know genetics plays, quite a big role.
Well, let's look at the classifications now of multiple sclerosis. And what's the most common? What's the least common? Let's go down that pathway.
So the classification system, again, that we've been taught in, for most of our life in medical school, is very likely completely wrong. So And it's worth just saying it because most of the GPs will have been taught that MS is, had 4 distinct types. There was relapsing remitting type, where you would have an attack and then you would recover. There was relapsing progressing, where you'd have an attack but perhaps not recover each time and then keep progressing after each attack. There was relapsing remitting with secondary progression, where you have an attack and you get better. And this goes on for many decades until finally it starts to progress. Or another type called primary progressive, where you just have a slow decline. Now, these are fairly artificial groupings and probably don't have that much distinction in true pathology. And MS really is a spectrum disease, and probably better classifications would be based on where the lesions were, what the presentation was, how severe the disease is. I mean, we know, for example, that around 6% of MS at least is incredibly benign. And never needs treatment and never causes any trouble. And that's at least, and that will grow as we get better and better at diagnosing it. For example, I was seeing a patient in the emergency department who was dying from colon cancer, and she was 85, and we're just going through the history, and she had typical attacks of MS when she was 30 and another one when she was 55, recovered after a few weeks, never had any treatment and never had any disability from the condition, but would be being diagnosed as having it. On the other spectrum, there are people who have severe attacks of uncontrollable relapses despite all the modern treatments, and have severe, terrible disability in a matter of short months to years. And there is absolutely everything in between. We were taught that, say, for example, primary progressive MS was a different condition that was probably degenerative. That's all been turned on its head. It's now known to be an inflammatory disorder. And we know that there aren't really subtypes and that there's a lot of overlap between them. And that most people, the most common presentation is that of a relapse and remission followed by a progression many decades after the onset of the illness. But there's every variation possible in between.
James, now that you've walked through the temple and tipped over all the tables, so all the GPs who learned the categorizations, they're on their head now. If they have a patient presenting and they are suspicious that MS might be at play, what sort of tests would you suggest they start with?
Well, look, it's important to remember that the only way that MS can be diagnosed is through the clinical history and examination. So there's no test currently that can actually diagnose MS. And radiologists skirt around this by using the word demyelination, which is their code for I think this is MS. And some radiologists will write reports where they believe they can almost diagnose it. But in all the criteria that there has to be a clinical and history element to it. So obviously MRI scan is the mainstay for diagnosis. I mean, there are certain relapses that are quite typical. And you would say that in about 99% of the cases, MS could be diagnosed without the need of an MRI scan. You would know beforehand based on the presentation of the typical relapses, whether it's inflammation of the eye nerve is a very common one where people get color washout of their vision. And that might happen over several hours to days, and the vision might slowly darken. And then after several weeks will improve. It's very, once you've seen it a few times, it's very classic. Another type of relapse gives you a sign called an internuclear ophthalmoplegia. And that mouthful is a poor word to use, isn't it? It's just such a complicated word. But all it means is that if you use it simplistically, one of the fastest things the brain has to do is move the eyes. You've got to move them real fast. And that involves a whole bunch of different muscles. And so the information that has to coordinate that has to be on the information superhighway, the broadband in the brain. And that's called the medium longitudinal fasciculus, or the MLF. But that's one of the most highly myelinated fibers, that is the most insulated fibers in the brain. It's like I said, it's broadband cable. Yeah. And so it's very early affected in MS. And often there'll be a very characteristic problems with movements of the eyes that people might not even report on, but you can see, and is almost entirely MS when it happens. And then there are other sort of typical relapses. So if there is a focal, that is, it affects a specific part of the body, problem with the brain or the optic nerve or the spinal cord, well, then the first step is an MRI scan. and these can be only subsidised under certain circumstances due to quite a frustrating Medicare system that we have. But that's the first test to do. Seeing a neurologist is obviously the best test, because then we can organise the most efficient number of tests to get the diagnosis with the least fuss. Of course, neurologists are in very high demand and we're very hard to see, which is frustrating. So often an MRI scan beforehand can be helpful. Yeah, if you do suspect MS, I mean, the thing that most helps us is to know what's happened. So the more detail we can get of the history, the more descriptive you can be, then we can fast track things quite well. So more important even than an MRI scan would be just a detailed description of the events that have happened.
And what is it that escalates the need to refer to a specialist? Are there some particular scenarios that you would hope a GP would hit the alarm button and just go for it?
Well, neurologists are often hard to see, and when the alarm buttons go, then it's time to go to the emergency department, not to necessarily to a neurologist, because we might, even for urgent cases, it might be a matter of weeks or months, and in some cases even years currently in Adelaide. I mean, look, if there is a disabling neurological deficit, and the old rule of neurology applies. I mean, in the year 2021, the most useful diagnostic test in neurology is the timing of events. So events that happen, click of a finger, are often vascular, that is a blood vessel blocking or bleeding. Events that happen over hours to days are inflammatory, and MS falls in that category. And events that happen over months are more likely to be malignant, and events that happen over years are degenerative. And that still remains my most useful diagnostic tool. So, look.
At least, James, you haven't turned everything on its head.
Yeah. The alarm bell would be for an emergency is significant disability. If someone is losing vision or going blind in one eye, if someone is becoming, is losing sensation, and it's affecting there's a line across the body at the spinal cord level. If people can't walk, these things, but these things are very obvious and simply must result in going to the emergency department. More mild things might necessitate an more urgent MRI scan, but the MRI scan reports are often more misleading than helpful. So, one of the reasons neurologists can be so busy is because every second radiology report will say this could be demyelination, and then everyone needs a neurology appointment, and then we're snowed under. So, it's tricky, and GPs have a very, very difficult job, but the history and understanding the time course of the symptoms that have occurred is the key.
If someone does manage to win the lottery and get some appointments with someone like yourself, what's the principle of treatment when someone has MS?
The first thing to say is that there are many types of MS that are mild enough not to need treatment. And that the treatments these days are fantastically successful. So we have absolutely incredible treatments for more severe and more moderate MS, and we can really stop the relapses in the vast majority of cases and really reduce the level of disability that would otherwise progress. Now, the thing with the brain is that once damage has occurred, it's very hard to undo it. So we're trying to act early to prevent the onset of relapses and disability. And there are a huge number of different treatments, and they're all designed to block the immune attack of the brain. And each has different pros and cons. And in an era of COVID, we have to be very careful when we're modulating the immune system. And so there are pros and cons to different treatments. And it'd be a little bit too complicated to go into all of that here. So in the short, all the treatments are essentially about preventing disability and preventing relapses. Once you have a relapse, the only treatment that is known to speed the recovery is prednisolone or steroids. And steroids are thought to improve the rate at which you recover, but not ultimately improve the amount of recovery you have. So, and there are pros and cons to using steroids. So steroids won't necessarily make you get any better in the end, but they will make you get better a bit faster. And we usually give a short course of steroids, such as via a drip, via an IV line. They can be given orally as well, and under some circumstances. So in terms of the acute treatment, that's really the only treatment we have available apart from supportive care. But in terms of controlling the MS, preventing disability, stopping relapses, we have, 20 to 30 treatments of all different types now. And it's quite specific to everyone's individual circumstances about how strong the treatment needs to be, what the risk profile we should take, how that might interact with pregnancies or, other family planning issues, and how it might interact with vaccine effectiveness.
Building on that, what is the prognosis for patients with MS? I'm picking up that there's some degree for positivity out of this.
Absolutely. People with MS, if you take every single person with MS, then and you look at life expectancy studies, the latest studies show that life expectancy might be 3 years less on average. But by and large, MS doesn't affect your life expectancy. There are some very severe forms which might be very treatment resistant, which much research is being performed on. But by and large, the vast majority of people, whilst we can't yet cure MS, and I don't think a cure is beyond the hope of humanity, within our lifetimes. I think that's not necessarily an impossible hope. We can effectively stop the disease in its tracks, which is really quite amazing. If you consider before 1990, there were no treatments whatsoever. And even though we don't fully understand the pathways and the pathogenesis, we can effectively stop relapses from occurring, and we can dramatically reduce the disability that may occur. So it's quite exciting, and indeed that is much of the conversation. And someone who's just been newly diagnosed is just to say, look, wait, don't panic. This is something we can do an awful lot with, and you can really have a normal life. That being said, the most severe disabilities that come with MS aren't necessarily things that you would think of at first hand. When people with MS, who perhaps at the end of their life, are asked what was the worst part of their MS, overwhelmingly everybody says fatigue. And that's pretty impressive given the kinds of disability that can happen with MS, to say that fatigue was the worst part. But this is a very reliably reported. And, the frustrating thing is, whilst we can stop the relapses and whilst we can stop a lot of the injury that occurs, fatigue is a very resistant symptom. So I don't want to undersell the level of disability that can occur with the condition, although it might not affect life expectancy, because it can be very harrowing, and there can be a lot of loss, with the process. And whilst the treatments are very good, they've got a way to go. And there are many aspects around treatment, if we move beyond immunomodulation, that come down to more common sense. For example, exercise is incredibly powerful at combating fatigue. No drug yet has ever been discovered that works on fatigue, but regular exercise, a terrible catch-22.
Yes.
Without any energy and you're exhausted and your doctor's telling you you've got to exercise, it can be very frustrating, but it does work. And we know that smoking has a huge role in worsening the symptoms of MS. And even today, 15% of Australians are smoking. And often sometimes people might visit their doctor, and the doctor might be thinking, well, life is terrible, you've got MS, well, you don't deny yourself, just have a cigarette. But that we now know that worsens the disability and the relapse rate, so much so that no matter what stage you are in your MS, there's a huge advantage in smoking cessation. So, I guess treatment takes in many aspects. There's lifestyle, exercise, monitoring mood. There's trying to deal with any symptoms that have occurred. And then we get to the nuts and bolts of medications. And the medications do a fantastic job, but the lifestyle factors are also absolutely huge. And the treatment's not always just done by doctors. There's a huge support group. The MS Society are particularly helpful in Australia, and they offer huge amounts of services, both for people who are newly diagnosed and with information sessions and counselling sessions. And the MS nurses have dealt with so many of the symptoms of MS that over such a long time that they're a huge resource. Many times patients might not know what questions to ask their doctor, but the MS nurse will be able to guide them through the process. So I think it's really important not to limit things like MS treatment to the medications and to the doctors, but it's really about a support network. But the overwhelming message is don't give up. It's not going to be easy, but there are huge things that can be done and huge changes that can be made, which result in massive improvements in quality of life.
And as we've heard so far in this episode with the tracking of this through history, this is the better time to be alive. Things are trending in the right direction. James, thank you so much for bringing some clarity to what is a complex scenario with lots of moving parts. But just before we end, given that you've, wandered through the china shop like a bull, for some things doctors have held dear, are there any little tips or tricks or advice that's not in the textbooks that would be handy to tuck into the side of the coat pocket for when dealing with patients?
So obviously there are quite a few things to remember. We've mentioned about the fatigue.
Yes.
One of the most important things that you can do for fatigue is exercise, particularly for spasticity or when muscles cramp down too much. Stretching can be very, very powerful. Now, every patient will be doing their own Google researching, and they will come to you with dietary requests about this diet or that diet. And it's worthwhile just saying at the moment that there's been no diet that as yet has been shown to be helpful in MS. A lot of people have a lot of different theories, but as Carl Sagan says, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And as yet, there isn't any. But having said that, I can tell you for a fact, even though there's no study on it, that if a patient goes and eats McDonald's and KFC every other day, then their MS will be very difficult to control. So we do know that healthy eating is going to be important. Another really big tip for GPs is sexual function. Sexual function is often very badly affected early in the onset of MS and is critically important, and patients will be reluctant to talk about. So it's something that you can quietly ask about. Depression is a huge aspect in MS, and so monitoring for mental health is hugely important. The whole subject of vitamin D is controversial, as I've outlined. Vitamin D varies in your blood almost hour by hour, and the vitamin D tests, by and large, aren't that helpful. We also now know that very high doses of vitamin D do cause problems with hardening of arteries. So, be wary about giving super maximal doses of vitamin D for a vitamin D blood test, and perhaps stick with more common sense, maybe just a couple of vitamin D tablets or drops every so often, rather than treating for a target blood test that makes not a lot of sense. That would be my big tips. And the final tip, of course, is, probably that applies to all of medicine, is don't forget smoking. It's still the leading cause of disability in so many areas. And, 15% is still a big number. And anything that you can say or do to help someone along the path of smoking cessation will be a great help for any conditions, but especially MS. So that would be my last tip.
I'll be much gentler with 16-year-old Steve who wanted to smoke to be cool and just couldn't. I'll just let him off the hook and say, you're actually had something fall in your favour on that front.
You dodged a bullet.
Yeah. Okay. In the words of Carl Sagan, you mentioned him earlier, Dr. James Leyden, thanks for the great work you're doing on this pale blue dot.
Thanks, Stephen. Take care.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.